Good morning, Nadia. How are you this morning?
Good, very good.
Fantastic. And very cold Madrid, as you were saying.
I know, trying to manage.
Who is our guest on the podcast this morning?
So today we have Jonathan dialing in from Portugal. Very excited to have you here, Jonathan, and thanks for making the time. So just quickly on Jonathan. Jonathan studied political science at Davidson College in North Carolina before working as a consultant at Capgemini and M2P Consulting in New York. He then moved to Purest. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
A software analytics company, in the Valley, in Silicon Valley, before picking up some customer success roles at names like Dropbox, Scoop, Phoenix, and, most recently Loom. He worked through customer success manager roles up to director level and ultimately becoming very, very active in the tech scene in the US, becoming, advisors for multiple startups and also working with, household VCs in the US, such as, becoming an expert in residence for first round capital, part of Lightspeed's operator network, as well as a scout for Andreessen Horowitz. Mm-hmm. And now Jonathan has moved across the pond from the US to Europe, to Portugal. And we're very, very excited to say that Jonathan is now working with us as part of the Kfund team as a venture partner to help our portfolios scale their customer success efforts. So Jonathan, you've done a lot of things, in the past 20 years, and with a strong, trend towards customer success. Can you tell us a little bit about, what was your thinking behind this? Why did you take the decision to go in this direction with your career?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the introduction, Natty. Guys, great to be here. This is super fun. My career's moved around a good amount, but I think in hindsight, there's always been a pretty solid trajectory or a straight line trajectory in terms of what I've been doing. But I think if I were to break it down into steps, the first bit, as you mentioned, I would start off my career in consulting. And the first job I took out of college was business information management consulting for financial services companies at Capgemini. So Capgemini is a huge global consultancy. I jumped at the opportunity to join them. But coming out of college, I had no idea what data management was. I had very little experience in financial services. But what I did have was a really great mentor who helped me learn the ropes working with customers. And so I had great opportunity to understand what customers were hoping to do, how to help build relationships and help them meet their goals. And so that really put me on a path to working with customers and gave me the mentality of understanding how to understand where a customer is today and where they're trying to go, building relationships and helping them chart the course between those two places. And so that's very applicable in consulting, but also very core to customer success. And so that really, I think, was the first important step. The second step, once my wife and I moved to San Francisco, I was at Burst, but then there's this huge opportunity to join Dropbox. And it was very exciting. Dropbox was moving up market, starting to bring in bigger and bigger customers. So they needed to figure out how do we deploy Dropbox to these larger companies, build user engagement, renew and grow customers. And so obviously Dropbox is like the classic PLG bottoms up motion. PLG wasn't a thing at that time, but it was this idea of, how do we take a small footprint of passionate users and grow that across an organization? And in 2013, Dropbox was, and it's still a fantastic company, but in 2013, it was like one of the clear top companies in the Valley. It was like them and Airbnb and like Stripe was just getting started. And so, and it was also like very groundbreaking tech, which sounds hilarious today. Not that it's not complicated, but it's just very, it's ubiquitous is that work is being done in the cloud. And back then it was, we'd get on calls with customers and be like, so if it rains, can I still access my data? And you'd be like, like we were literally having those conversations. And so it was very cutting edge at the time and, one of these very hot companies. And so I was, one of the founding CSMs at Dropbox. I started within the first week, I got Under Armour, Fitbit, Spotify as some customers, and I needed to figure out what to do with them. And so this put me both like in the heart of the San Francisco tech scene, but also working with really great companies at the cutting edge of technology. And then, working with absolutely top caliber people across the company. And so I got to see and understand what the best of the best looks like in Silicon Valley. And so for me, I stayed at Dropbox for about 4 years, but it was this huge inflection point in my career. and worked with people that are, like Yamini Rangan, who is now the CEO of HubSpot, sat a row behind me, and she was on sales operations. Worked with Kevin Egan, who's been leading sales at Slack and Atlassian. Christina Capioca is the founder of Vanta. She and I did like a keynote at a Dropbox event together. I mean, like the people that you came across in that environment, there's a strong Dropbox mafia. And so I think that network and that experience has been really instrumental for me. And then the third step is coming out of Dropbox. I wanted to take on a CS leadership role and build customer success in kind of how I knew it should be built, or wanted to experiment what it would look like. And so I found a company to do that with, but I also realized I needed more at-bats, and because my experience was just out of Dropbox. And so I reached out to some of my friends in venture and asked them what portfolio companies could I advise, which would be a great opportunity for me to learn those business models, but also maybe could be helpful for them as well. And so that was an important moment for me, because it unlocked this new passion and ability to start working with early stage companies and understand CS, how it should be built from a strategic standpoint. And then I turned that into a role with First Round Capital, as you mentioned, did expert in residence with them for almost 5 years, worked with maybe 50 of their portfolio companies over that time. But ultimately that experience became the foundation of what I'm doing now, which is advising and consulting companies on customer success.
Fantastic. That's quite a bio, Jonathan. So I think one of the really interesting things there is that you talk about kind of the almost a golden age, and you've really given me a kind of trip down memory lane with, I was just thinking about the green ticks you used to get next to files, like in like 2012, 2013 Dropbox. And having been someone who was always interested in technology, I could never really quite get my head around how it was managing to do asynchronous syncing of everything, like how it actually managed to make it all work. I
can explain that to you, actually.
I mean, go for it. I'd love to.
So it's one of these lessons that I learned during orientation, and I'll never forget. Dropbox had this incredible office, and we were in the Lego room, and so there's this massive conference room table that could fit probably 12, 16 people around it, and there was just a huge pile of Legos across the table. And so you're in meetings, but you're like building Legos. And there was this really interesting way of being creative. Anyway, the point is, I remember being in that room, and Matt Beatty, who was one of the product managers at the time, was giving us an overview on how Dropbox works. And essentially, it's incredibly, for somebody who's non-technical like me, it made a heck of a lot of sense. But the idea is that if you take a picture, you can break that picture down. Like, imagine if you cut a grid across that picture into small little sizes. What Dropbox does is it scans across across all the grids and looks in each little box and says, has this box been updated? And if it's been updated, then it will update that change. And if it hasn't been updated, then it won't. And so really you've got kind of, again, layman speak, but two different servers. One is the actual metadata around the file. The other is the actual data within it. And all they're doing is scanning to see where the changes are and updating those changes. And so that's how it can work so quickly. And I mean, it's... my head was exploding. Like, wow,
but it makes. I remember, like, it's the first time someone explained how BitTorrents work. It's a very similar concept, right? How you work out how 500 people across the world have access. So the question I was going to ask was, and I think it kind of relates to this, is obviously at that time you also had Box, you also had early OneDrive, you were starting. I don't know if Google Drive was around then, but it was obviously came quite quickly later. And Dropbox obviously now is not, like, it would be probably the market leader in the sense of that being its core product. But what was the key to success at that point? Was it the tech itself? Was it the product? Was it your ability to delight customers? What stood you guys apart at that point?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, you mentioned some of the key players. Box took a very enterprise first focus, and so they went top down. Dropbox went the exact opposite, bottoms up. OneDrive was, I think, a little bit later, and so it wasn't so much of an established player at that time. And Google Drive was there as well, I think, but not as relevant because you had to be in the Google suite, right, to be able to store at that time. You had to be able to be in the Google suite to store your products. So it was really us versus Box. And I think that if we're to kind of zoom out, what was the biggest factor of Dropbox's success? I mentioned it was one of these shining examples of early PLG, and that wasn't even really a concept at that time, but it was this referral program that Dropbox put in place, right, where you would invite people, and then you would get 2 gigabytes of space, and then I think it was 2 gigabytes of space, and then they would get 2 gigabytes of space. And space being the kind of the atomic unit of what you're buying with Dropbox, that has a lot of value. Now, if I invite people, I get more space. That means I get to put more stuff into my Dropbox account. And so it had this crazy snowballing effect. I mean, when I joined Dropbox, we were about 400 people as a company. But, we had, 100 million users at that time. And I mean, and then it's high. I don't know if it's past 1 billion now, but I mean, the thing grew so fast. But a lot of it had to do with this referral program where we were trading value as an incentive for people to sign up. But then what happened was you'd start adding stuff into your Dropbox folders. And so that would be the place of consolidation, tax returns, photos, documents, like all the things that matter to you. If your house burned down in a fire, you still had everything that was in a Dropbox account. And so it became very sticky. So growth exploded, Dropbox became very sticky. And then as we started to move up market, you would look at companies and be able to say, like legitimately 60 or 70% of your employee population is already using Dropbox at work, which means that they're definitely using it personally, right? So we used to be able to look across domains and say, okay, like this company that we want to talk to, they have this many people that have registered on their company domain. So we'd reach out to that company and you'd be able to say, look, we think that this is a great product for you and it'll enhance productivity and you'll, all the benefits. And they would say, well, like, I don't know. I don't have budget for that. I don't know that I need that. You say, okay, let me rephrase this for you. 60 or 70% of your employee population has your business IP in their personal Dropbox accounts that you don't have access to. How do you feel about that now? Right. And so they'd say, and they say, well, okay, but like, that's the stick, but let's go with the carrot. You're going to look like a visionary. Right. And that's, so that we could get things started that way. But really the user love, I think, was really important to Dropbox's success. And when we would go head to head against Box, you say, well, how many people are using Box? And they say, not very many. You say, okay, great. Well, we just talked about, these crazy numbers among the Dropbox folks. OneDrive coming in was really challenging because Microsoft has such strong distribution, and they were packaging OneDrive for free. So if you had Microsoft Suite or you had some of the Microsoft server setups, they would say, hey, like just, they were trying to knock us out. But again, I think it came down to this idea of we have this strong base of users. They're very actively using Dropbox. And then, here's their lovely stories about how Dropbox saved the day. That would be a question that I would ask customers from time to time, like customer end users, because those would be the shining examples of a time that, it was really valuable. But then I remember, like, as we were combating OneDrive, I remember going to Under Armour and I had them wall to wall on licenses, 97% 6-month active use, 93% quarterly active use, and 87% 1 month active use. So they were very, very heavily using Dropbox. And even still, there was this competitive situation with Microsoft going on. And till I showed them a slide that said, you have 1.5 billion connections between all the files within Under Armour. And I just let that sit out there because, like, okay, yes, that, like, what are you going to do with that? You're going to migrate that over into OneDrive, please.
And what does that? So, what does that mean? 1.5 billion connections, references of files to files, or folders with subfolders, like
sharing relationships. So, if I have a deck, shared it out across 4,000 or 5,000 people at Under Armour,
so the interactions, right?
The interactions, right? Okay, and so, imagine a filing system where all the files have different connections that it's been shared out to. The thing would be impossible to recreate. And so, they essentially knew, okay, well, now this thing is fundamental to the way that we run our business. So I was actually able to turn that into like a multi-year contract with expansion off of it, but it was all based on this deep level penetration. Anyway, I've taken us down deep into that, but I think this user love and referral program was really core to the baseline. The other element that I'd say was really important that I should touch on is the focus on talent. And Dropbox just made a really, really high hiring bar. There'd be thousands of applications for every single job. The interview process was not overly long, but was decisive and like really clear around what we were looking for. And I think that not only were we bringing in A quality people, but then you look around and see other A quality people, and then you're like, well, that motivates me to do my best because I want to be an A quality person as well. And so it kind of builds this momentum around performing at a high level.
And Jonathan, like these themes, like a happy user base, like an active one, making sure that they know you are solving a pain point, great talent, like are these themes replicable? Are they the same across, the other businesses that you've worked for, at Scoop, at Loom, or how are they different? How are they the same?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that Dropbox in many ways set the standard for what could be achieved. But I mean, the story of Dropbox's growth for a long time, it was the fastest growing or fastest adopted software. I think that's kind of more unique. But there's elements there that I think are important. Like Scoop, for example, was a B2B2C type of play as well, where we'd sell a carpooling program to a company and then try to drive adoption among their employees to get into carpools so that they could take to work to deliver impact for the business. And so those factors, like how do we get people engaged? How do we get them to adopt it? How do we get them to use it more frequently? And then how do we tie that back to value for the company? Like that's the same theme from Dropbox. And the same thing is true of Loom as well, where that's much even closer to Dropbox, where you have a software that people can adopt, become more productive. And then the stakeholders tends to be the same types of buyers that we were seeing in Dropbox. I actually had the same stakeholder at Spotify at Loom as I did 8 years before at Dropbox, this guy named Brett. He's an awesome guy. Brett, if you're listening, what's up, buddy? But it's the same stakeholder looking for the same success criteria. And so, it's this combination of, adoption and user engagement with the actual product. The perception of value, I think like that's really important. And then the relationships that you're able to develop with the customer, and those things tied together, you ultimately are trying to look at what is this customer making this purchase for? What is the problem that we're solving? Trying to quantify that and measure it as clearly as possible. And then when it's time to have an expansion conversation or renewal conversation, being able to point back to that initial success criteria and say, look at, this is what you were trying to do. This is what we've achieved for you. Ideally, it's higher than you expected. And so this is a partnership that you should continue to invest in.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And so I think you've mentioned previously when you left Dropbox, it was probably not a corporate, but it was looking a lot more like even post scale up. I don't think we have a name for it, kind of big tech company, I suppose, than a scale up. Yeah. And you went at that point, I think, to Scoop, which was quite small. And then I think you also joined Loom at a relatively or somewhat early stage. Like, I'd be interested to know, because you've hit a couple of winners there. What were the themes in terms of what you were looking for? Like, were there specific signals? Were you hunting places that had, I don't know, particular % customer growth or engagement? Were you looking at it from a KPI perspective, or were you actually just engaging with founders that you thought were phenomenal? Like, how did you think about making those moves?
Yeah, it's changed as my career has progressed. And at Dropbox, coming out of Dropbox, I was really hyper focused on taking a leadership role. I wanted to own the function and I wanted to build it. Coming out of Dropbox at the time I think it was Series C-ish. But yeah, we had 2,200 employees, 11 offices globally, big sales team, customer success and post-sale function was something like 60 or 70 people. So I mean, it was quite big. So I wanted to go and with Scoop in particular, it was, can I find a small company where I can be on the leadership team, build my vision for customer success, own revenue? The second criteria was mission orientation. I wanted to work on something that I felt was really important. And so Scoop checked the box because it makes an impact for people and their commute and for the environment. So I felt good about that. And I think the third piece was the opportunity size and just trying to gauge where the market was. With Loom, it was a bit different because I had now done leadership roles both at Scoop and at Phoenix in between. And so both like VP type roles in both of those companies. And so with Loom, I went into a director role, but it was a much bigger company at that time, a Series B. And I was taking on, the interesting challenge there was I was taking on two functions and bringing them together into one. So there wasn't really a customer success function. There were a few folks on the team at that time that were hired to be CSMs, but we hadn't really gone up market yet. And so timing wise, it was like 2021, we'd closed HubSpot and Atlassian as the first two actual enterprise deals. So the folks that had been hired to be CSMs were actually starting to do some customer success work. So that was very nascent. And I liked the idea of building from scratch with solid momentum. And then I was bringing on a support function, or taking the existing support function, which had excellent an excellent leader, but she had a very, very large team reporting to her. And so it needed some structure, needed some help with strategy. And so it's kind of a very, very different challenge in my first time taking on support. So I came in as the head of customer experience and ultimately built up the success and support functions in parallel under a customer experience umbrella. So that was a bit different. But with Loom, at the time that I joined, we maybe had like 14 million people using the product, and it sounded very similar to the Dropbox story. I'd heard podcasts with Joe talking to Harry Stebbings about, Loom and the culture he's building and how the product hits people, and started playing with the product. And admittedly, it takes a little bit to get used to and to get comfortable with. But I saw that there was like, okay, this is actually very transformative if it's used in the right way. And so thought, okay, if there's companies that we can sell this into, I think that could be a really interesting problem to try to go and solve, and an interesting company to build on with great trajectory.
Fantastic. And actually on that theme, because I think I agree, I've always found Loom an interesting one, and I'm obviously not a PM or an engineer, so I'm not probably the ideal use case of someone who has to explain something to other people frequently. Yeah. I've always thought of it as one of those products that potentially could have moved more broad than it has, that it's kind of very much remained in doing the thing that it does really well. Yep. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's something that they could have moved beyond that? Do you think there's room for growth in that product, or do you think actually it should be a kind of like goal dilution thing of just do one thing and do one thing really, really well?
It's a great question. And it's a question that I think is something that I've seen a few times in my career as well. It's like at Dropbox, it's very famous. Steve Jobs tried to buy Dropbox, and Drew and Arash turned him down. And he then said, "Well, Dropbox is a feature. It's not a company." Or it's a product, not a company. Something like
Ironically, when Apple also bought Shazam, which is actually a feature, not a company.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting lens, right? It's like, okay, is this something that, and like what defines a company? And obviously, like Dropbox is a company and has continued to build, and Dropbox has continued to try to innovate, but it hasn't created Dropbox, 2.0 that's doubled the market cap of the company. It's still, give or take, roughly where they went public in 2016 or 17. Mm-hmm. So if you apply that same lens to Loom, it's like we hit on something that really resonated with a passionate group of users, and that there's value for. And Max, if you need some help after talking about use cases for Loom, I'm happy to run you through a session on it. But I do think it's like, okay, well, what are those adjacencies that would make sense given this context? I think that with Loom in particular, it always made much better sense as part of a broader platform. And I think that with the Atlassian acquisition, the distribution advantage for Loom is going to be significant. And so, I'm sure, though, I don't know what the details are in terms of how they're planning on rolling it out. I know that the Loom team is kind of still operating within the Atlassian umbrella. But when you start layering in Loom capabilities on top of Atlassian's existing products, the usage of Loom is going to go to the moon.
Sure.
And when we were pre-acquisition, you think like, okay, Microsoft acquisition of Loom would be fire. I mean, this would go from a business that's sub 100 million in revenue to a couple 100 million in revenue, almost instantaneously, because you'd be able to tackle that market population. So I think it kind of reached about as much it could get. And especially given the way that the market turned, the other question that's really critical is Loom a nice to have, or is Loom a must have? And I think it's a nice to have, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. You can run a business on, and everybody's been running businesses on email and phone and Slack, right? In-person stuff. And so there's a core Zoom. So there's a core suite of products that you need to run a business. I think Loom is this nice to have. It can give you some great advantages, but making that story resonate with the broader customer population, I think is tough.
I did an example, I think yesterday or the day before, where I did exactly Loom functionality just directly from Slack. That I was able to screen record with a little black bubble of me in the corner, and it gave me not everything you could have, but close enough. Yeah,
I was going to say, Max, we can have a little competitive session after, and I'll show you where Slack falters.
Nadia, have you got anything pressing to ask right now?
No, I mean, the next question that I wanted to ask was essentially, you talked a lot about your motivations for moving from one company to another. And I think as someone that's also still quite early in my career, right, I'm just curious in terms of what you'd be looking for if you were to look for a full-time role now in the current tech landscape.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, personally, I'm super happy with doing what I'm doing, which is great. So I'm not having to think deeply about that question. But for folks out there, as I would reflect on this, I think that like my career and the criteria in terms of different roles has evolved as my life has evolved. I think that your life stage in many ways can dictate your work goals. And, for me personally right now, a huge driver of mine and of my family's being here in Europe is to experience this life together. And, versus, pre-kids, mid-20s, it's all about career progression, grinding, taking on more responsibility, taking bigger risks. Not that I'm like super risk averse now, but my focus is just much more on, okay, like what pieces of work do I want to work with, like to work on with who, how do I maximize time with my family and kind of figure out a different way of balancing things. I think that the last few years have really thrown a wrench into finding those next roles. Obviously I'm following the US employment reports. You see that employment's very low. You hear about these huge layoffs. It's hard to reconcile. And I think, I'd mentioned previously, there were some clear winners in 2013 when I was going to Dropbox. It was like, yeah, this thing is going to be awesome. Airbnb, going to be awesome. I don't know what those are now. And I think that the AI landscape has really shifted it up. And I'm not sure if it's been that the opportunity is just more spread or more democratized, but I can't really point to who, other than some obvious players, I can't really point to like who are some of the next up and coming winners in this space. There's a lot that's having to be shaken out, and I don't know what those essentially what those businesses look like. I mean, there's the news from Pitch earlier this week, right? And you're like, oh, this is a great product, people love it. I don't know what their financial situation is, and then they go and they lay off 2/3 of the company and say like, things aren't so good, and you're like, well, okay. That would have been a fun one to maybe work at, but I think that beyond the macro, that what you can only control what you can control. And so what I think about is think about what your risk appetite is, think about what your time horizon is, think about what learnings you'd be hoping to achieve, think about how compensation factors into that. And I think that my experience has been moving between companies fairly regularly. I think the longest stint I've had is sub 4 years. And so, sometimes that is because of the macro environment. Sometimes that's because the challenges I've just surpassed the challenges or the opportunity size that I see. And so if you think about it, where moving is not a bad thing and moving can be an opportunity, there may be reasons to join specific companies for specific purposes, to work with a great leader, to take on a different scope of work that you may be interested in tackling. And so I think it's that combination of risk appetite, your time horizon, what you hope to learn and achieve during that time. And then as long as you're learning and you're earning, like those are pretty good things, and you see where it goes. Equity is all upside anyway. It can't be banked on. So
no, I pinned one thing that you said earlier, because it's like there's pre-kids Jonathan and post-kids Jonathan. And then you also mentioned risk appetite, right? And then from my point of view, moving all the way to Europe and then going freelance, that is a very high risk appetite for someone, with children, with a family. And so what was the thinking behind that, and then what made you decide to actually pick Europe as, your home base for now?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there. The TLDR on the Europe move was, I have 2 kids now; they're 8 and 4. So at the time that we made a decision to move to Europe, we were 6 and 2. My wife and I, even when the 2-year-old was just after she was born, we did an exercise called the 80th birthday exercise that we put together, and we spent weeks kind of going to coffee shops, going to breweries, talking through it. But the fundamental premise is it's your 80th birthday. You're looking back on your life. You're still alive. It's your birthday. What are you most proud of? Who's there? What are they saying about you? And what are you happy that you've accomplished? And so you start to drill into each of those questions and pull the thread apart. And then you start to be able to identify themes, shared goals with your spouse. And then you can map those things against a timeline and say, as an example, I want to climb Kilimanjaro. I should probably do that in the next little bit of time, because when I'm 80, my knees probably aren't going to be holding up for that, right? Versus I want to write a book, which I don't. But that can wait until later. And so you start to be able to say, okay, here's this timeline of things that are important to me, or things that would resonate or make me proud in the future, and start to build a bit of a life plan. And my wife and I both come up with that we want to live abroad. And so following the pandemic, and at Loom, it was a remote first company, my wife said, hey, I want to take a break from the work that she was doing. She does brand marketing work. And we said, well, is this an opportunity for you to take a break here in San Francisco? And is that what we want? Or is this the opportunity for us to take a jump into something that we think is important for us? And we'll ease into it. We'll do 6 months in Europe. And she said, okay, well, what does that look like? And so I put together an itinerary. We did 3 months in the Alps. We did 3 months in Scotland. We were planning on going back to California, and for a variety of reasons decided, well, this is actually much closer to the life that we want to be living. So where can we stay for longer? And Portugal has a great visa program that allows us to come here. My dad's side of the family is Portuguese. The language is similar enough to Spanish that we figured we could pick it up. Mais ou menos. And
I was going to say, how's that
yeah. And the climate's great. So then we came here, and I was still at Loom, so I was able to have pretty good structure in that type of move. My wife set up her own consulting business, so now she's working with climate companies on brand marketing. Started picking that up, and then as I was saying, I should maybe be considering leaving Loom. I had an opportunity to with a Portuguese company to jump in and do some consulting work for them on a fractional basis. And so for me, that was a pretty clear off ramp of, okay, yeah, I can go into this thing that I've always really enjoyed, and that I think is a fairly risk controlled environment. And if I need to go do something full time after, great. But in the meantime, I'll learn through this experience, and that pretty much got it started. And so, it does, from the outsider's perspective, move my young family to Europe and go independent and out into the unknown. But I think the other piece of it is if it sets up the right work and lifestyle environment, and I've got good confidence in what I can do for companies, and if that's going to continue to be valuable for early stage startups, then there shouldn't be a shortage of work, and I should feel confident moving in that direction, and can always pull the ripcord if I need.
Jonathan, you have a wonderful combination of American exuberance and a kind of structured way of thinking that makes everything sound completely logical and there's no alternative. And obviously you would just reverse engineer the steps to come to Europe and it would make complete sense.
There we go.
But I think I'm going to really kind of shoehorn a segue in here, which is that type of structured thinking, I think, works, from everything I understand about your function, incredibly well for understanding how to delight a customer over time, right? And the first round review, which you shared with us, which I think also we were talking as a team, contributing to a first round review is a real startup world kind of bucket list. So congratulations on that. I know you've worked with us there really, really closely, but it's a really good piece of work. We'll share it in the notes afterwards. But it defines customer success as something around a function that protects and grows the customers you already have, and something that becomes increasingly relevant as you begin to transition from growth at all costs to growing healthily, both within and outside of your existing customer base. Yeah. Does that definition resonate with you? Is that a definition that you would understand? How would you define it?
Yeah. Well, first, on participating in the first round review, that was on the life plan. So check that one off.
Was it actually on the life plan?
Yeah, it was.
Hey, that's amazing.
Cool. It's a big honor. A great team over there. I think that makes sense. I think the definition of customer success has evolved a lot, and I think Salesforce has given a lot of credit for starting it off. But the double click there is that Salesforce also has, on an account team, they have seller, like an AE, they have a CSM, they have a account manager sometimes, there's a solutions architect, there's an onboarding person. The point is, you have this multi-person pod that's responsible for various accounts. And so customer success in Salesforce is all about end user education and enablement. And if you view Salesforce, like there's a pretty significant need for that, right? But it's a very narrow scope for what customer success is. And I think over the last decade or so, the role has taken on increasing importance or relevance in just overall post-sale operations and ownership of customers. And so, I think that at the end of the day, customer success is really ultimately about delivering happy customers that retain and grow. So in that sense, it aligns very well with that first round definition. And there's like a variety of metrics there, but that key output metric is around net dollar retention, in my view, is around net dollar retention. And so therefore it is about the retention and growth and protection of churn for those customers. But that in and of itself is not like, you can't just focus blindly on that. There's a ton of input metrics that actually result in a customer being happy and wanting to grow and seeing value. And so that's I think at the highest level, like what customer success would be considered.
So that actually, I think, was one of the things in the first round review, right? Was talking about the different metrics that you would use to measure success: usage, net revenue retention, time to value, potential internal KPIs. And I suppose net dollar retention is the purest one because you are retaining the revenue from that customer, but can also preclude where you have, for example, I don't know, I'm thinking in a sector where like something like HR tech, where a lot of people don't love most of, like, the NPS of most HR tech platforms is super low, but people don't churn massively because you have a huge amount of sunk time and cost getting set up on it. And everyone kind of has acknowledged that the products, most of them are good at one thing or two things, but none of them really nails the whole suite particularly well, obviously, apart from our portfolio company Factorial, which does it exceptionally. What are the kind of like the metrics that feed into that? And is that your rationale behind net dollar retention, that it's the purest metric, and kind of like how do you think about it more holistically?
Yeah, I don't know if it's I think in the sense that it's very clear what impact you're driving for the business, it's the purest metric, right? It's did customers renew and grow, or are we contracting? Gross revenue retention would be the number of accounts that you're losing, which is also an important metric to be measuring, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Because if a company is losing 3, out of 100 customers every month or every quarter or whatever period of time, like there is some contraction. But if the net dollar retention numbers, which means the existing customers, are growing, then like as a CEO of a business, I'm seeing growth. We maybe want to start to understand why there might be some churn of customers, but like the overall business metric of dollars is what we're going for. Then that seems to be the thing that you're pointing at. I think about, the way that, again, going to kind of how I structure things, the post-sale can be broken into phases, and then each phase has stages. So now you're really going into the mind of Jonathan. But the
into the kind of the Thunderdome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, buckle up. You need to kick off a customer and get them onboarded. So that would be the first phase, if you will. The second phase is around that life cycle. What happens between the time the customer is up and running, the time that they start to see value, until pretty much the commercial cycle, which is, all right, how do we go about preventing them from churning, retaining them, and growing them? So I think about those 3 phases, and then the stages are each of the major like core activities or buckets that takes place in each phase. And there's metrics associated with all of it. So, as an example, in a Dropbox context or a Loom context, you buy licenses. Okay, well, great. I bought 100 licenses. Now what? Well, I need to get them deployed to people. So I need to go identify who are the 100 people that need a license. I need to send them an invite email or get them set up via SSO, whatever it might be. And then they need to start using it. And then you want them to use it more often, right? So there's all these like product adoption and engagement metrics that matter in terms of getting that customer to the sense of value. And then from there, it's like, okay, well, are customers engaging with our support team? Are there tickets that are still outstanding? Are customers participating in QBRs? Are they giving us positive feedback on things like NPS? Are they becoming a public reference for us? Are they giving us product feedback? Are they sitting in on sessions with our leadership team? Do we know who the stakeholders are? Right? Like these are all considerations that all take place within that customer lifecycle. And there's various ways of weighting those things. That's also ultimately kind of how you build a health score. But at the end of the day, the customer will be asked, the customer has a contract end date, right? So are they going to renew, or what are they going to do? And so that's really like the combination of doing well and all those things that I just mentioned will ultimately get you to a place where the customer sees that there's been value, sees that there's good partnership, and sees the reason to continue to invest in this relationship moving forward. And so I'm always trying to talk to the companies I'm talking to about positioning things in the idea of a partnership. The renewal is a logistical challenge, less a decision point, right? It's a logistical thing. You have to go and write a new contract and agree to terms, but like it shouldn't interrupt the general flow of that partnership over time because you're adding a lot of value along the way.
Mm-hmm. And if you're building a company, when would you actually know to hire a dedicated person to build this, full-on customer success machine? Right?
And maybe to add to Nadee's question, how early should you be thinking about it? So like it's because I presume there's a period of thinking about it before you get to that person.
Because it does sound like a full investment, right? And then
it should be a full investment. It's a great question, and I think it's a challenging scenario because you have an early stage company that first and foremost needs to build a product, right? That's like table stakes. Then you need to go to market with that product. So then you start to sell it, and then lo and behold, you have customers, and you're like, okay, oh man, like now what do we do? And so it's I've seen so many times early stage founders that then become the customer success manager because that's the situation that they're in. Because now they have customers and somebody needs to manage it. The most extreme one I've seen was this really cool tech out of Seattle, Smart Team. And the founder essentially sold 2 of the largest grocery chains in the US right off the bat. And so then he was like, well, I can't blow this, but I also am the CEO and trying to build a company and stuff, but like I need to be on the phone with Albertsons and Safeway like all the time. And so, he gets on the phone with me. He's like, what do I do? So that was an interesting one to figure out because there are such enterprise expectations and challenges there. Anyway, I think you kind of always have to be I think about customer success, like there's a function that is what you're asking, but there's a mentality around it as well. And maybe that sounds a bit abstract, but it's this idea of understanding that like your customers are the lifeblood of your business. And so investing in the idea of if not delighting, but like managing your customers or showing your customers value is really, really important early on. I think that there are a couple of things that without hiring somebody you can be doing as an early stage founder to set up your customers to be successful right from the outset. The first is keeping good data. And so as you've got contracts coming through, knowing when they're renewing, knowing what they bought, like being able to just kind of track even in a Google spreadsheet will pay off huge dividends later on when somebody actually does come in and then they say, where are we with our customers? And if you don't have those answers put together in a thoughtful way, it's really, really hard. The second thing is thinking scalably. And by that, I mean, understanding that for what you do for one customer today, you should expect that you'll be doing it for future customers as well. And so try to minimize one-off efforts. Try to say, okay, well, we spent 4 hours putting together this kickoff presentation that we just did for our first customer. Great. That is now the template, right? You're not going to build another one net new for the next customer that comes in. Similar like email responses, support is a great example of one of these things where it's like, how do I use this? How do I use this? And as you pick up volume, you're going to get the same question over and over again. So figure out how to scale and systematize things. And I think the last piece is with those early customers, understanding what is the success criteria early on. And so a customer makes the purchase. It's very easy to click into, great, let me get you set up. Right. And off you go and you're running, you're getting them set up and off they go. But then when they come up for renewal, nobody ever asked them why they bought in the first place. And so then you don't have a compelling story around how you've met their goals, how you're showing them so much value and why they should renew. And so I see a lot of companies have early drop off of customers or bad retention numbers off of those initial customers because they didn't know what they were trying to accomplish with those customers in the first place.
Interesting. And one of the things I think about quite a lot is the kind of people versus product debate in this. Not necessarily a debate, but the weighting between people and product in the sense that some products sell themselves, right? Some products are just like insanely sticky based on, as you talk about, kind of mission critical nature of the product.
Yep.
But most aren't. Most are providing a marginal value, and there is a competitive suite out there. And I think about, for example, one of our portfolio companies, TLDV, who I know you're already working with, and you can hack your way to what TLDV does using a combination of other tools. It is an incredibly valuable tool once you get into it, but it's not necessarily something that you wouldn't be able to function as a business without. And what I think TLDV do exceptionally well is they tell the story around their product, they engage their customers, and they are an incredibly, like, they manage the human side of customer success, as far as I can see, incredibly well. So from your perspective of, I suppose, working with some tools that, like a Dropbox, which is unbelievably sticky, and then something maybe like a Loom, which I imagine is a little bit less sticky in certain cases. Yep. How do you feel about that weighting, and how do you as customer success work with product and engineering to make sure that you're in sync on what customers want and how you make that work?
Yeah, it's an awesome question. It's something we talked a lot about at Loom in particular, because it is more of that nice to have nature. And as much as we wanted it to be a must have, again, like, it wasn't there yet. But it is product led growth. There's a lot of the product, it's easy to use. And so people can get up and running. And so if they're able to see value, and they're able to, we calculated it at some point, but it was like, if you record 3 videos or share a video and get 3, views, then all of a sudden you'll be something like 80% more likely to continue using it, or something on those lines. So you're trying to drive towards those adoption metrics. I think that, I think you're right though, that there is probably more than ever a broad competitive suite of products out there in whatever it is you're trying to build. So that's not to say there aren't like new and innovative things out there, but as you said, you can cobble together pieces of different things to get what you need. And so the question I ask myself as a customer success leader is like, okay, so then imagine that all the products are just table stakes. So what's the differentiator? Well, are you more likely to invest in a company that you know is taking good care of you? Or are you going to deal with somebody who's just cold calling you, selling you something, and then disappearing? And so in that sense, I actually think of customer success as like a huge differentiator in retention and in a company's ability to be successful. And, there's this, I don't know if you're familiar with Danny Meyer. He's a restaurateur. He created Shake Shack. Anyway, he has really great books around hospitality. And it's something that I've actually given out to my customer success team. And then we've read it and we've talked about it. But it's like, how do we bring hospitality into what we're doing? And hospitality, defined by Danny Meyer, is something along the lines of like, hospitality exists when the person across the table from you believes they're on the same side of the table in the negotiation, something along those lines, where they believe that you're working on towards the same goal is the idea. And so that's where, when I'm saying, hey, understand success criteria, it's not just that you have better notes about why the customer bought. It's so that you and the customer are simpatico about what it is that you're trying to accomplish over the course of that year. You're showing that you've listened, and they're sitting there being like, Jonathan's a real partner. He understands me, he understands my business. He's like looking for ways of adding value. I'll continue with Jonathan. His product's a little bit more expensive. We've got some problems with the features, but I believe in this relationship, because at the end of the day, we're still people, right? Yeah. So I think that plays a huge role. I tend to build customer success teams focused with people that are great relationship orientation people, and who can go and build that trust with customers, because I think that is the differentiator. If, there's Loom and there's a bunch of other products that are out there that all do video recording. So how do we stand out?
And sorry, Nadia, I'll pass over to you in a sec, but this just prompted a question. So I was looking at a startup yesterday that simplifies the process of ordering using your phone in restaurants. And they claim to be able to give an uplift of around 20% in terms of order value by adding on, and we've all seen it on Deliveroo, Glovo, Grubhub, that kind of, are you sure you wouldn't like a drink, or are you sure you wouldn't like an extra snack at the end? And you go, oh yeah, maybe I do want a cookie. And I think that kind of upsell in terms of like a nudge behavioral perspective is very clever. I'd love to hear if there's any kind of tricks and lessons you learn in growing contracts where you are already providing a very solid base service, and you're kind of there aren't any more features in the product that you're really offering, like how you've come to think of those, how you work across teams in an organization to create upsell opportunities, and then maybe some kind of, if there are any hacks around that.
Yeah, well, so the answer, there's a caveat there, in that often in customer success, you're dealing with customers of different sizes. And so like Loom has very, very long tail. There's thousands of companies as customers, and then there's, a couple dozen maybe enterprise level customers. And so the approach with those types of customers is going to be very different than the stuff that's down in long tail of your customers. And the approach that you can take to them is very different too. So like a white glove enterprise relationship is you're spending 4 hours a week with them and, really going deep into their business and building relationships across. And a small company, you have tech touch. And so you're trying to keep some kind of meaningful cadence and show them value while not really assigning a full person to that role in that case. And so there's a bit of that. I think in terms of, growth, imagine you've got these customers that are tapped out. I think putting on the hat of, okay, what can I do with this customer relationship that continues to find ways of adding value to our business that's really the question. I think that what you're asking and how I think about it as well. Mm-hmm. The example I would give is in my I stayed with most of my initial customers at Dropbox over that full time that I was there. And so even though I was leading a region, I still had 10 of our largest customers, but I was able to manage those relationships because I've had those relationships for 3 years. And so I had everybody on call, but I'd also maximized those licenses. So they were all wall to wall. So then looking at what value can I create? Well, is Under Armour a public reference? Like, wouldn't it be cool to have a great case study or a video case study of them doing a testimonial about how Dropbox has made an impact for them? So that's an angle. If I always wanted to have Microsoft as a challenger, then I should just keep them on a 1-year contract cycle, right? Is there a way for me to get them onto a 3-year contract cycle so that I'm not having defensive renewal conversations and the opportunity to get bid down every single year? So I think that there are a couple of different, even if you've maximized the product upsell expansion opportunity, things like bringing in referenceability, things like multi-year contracts, those are definitely two angles that I would pursue to try to really figure out what's that overall value that customer can be providing back. In terms of like other hacks, I tend to lean more towards like being able to trade price point for duration. And I think that the other element there in pricing and packaging is coming up with different options that give the customer various points to pick between in proposals. So I often see clients of mine that go out to customers and say, hey, here's your proposal for next year. And so the customer is either going to go thumbs down, up, thumbs down, but they're typically going to push on price or whatever terms it is. But if you give them options and you say, well, you can get a bit of a better price for an extra year of commitment and public reference, or you can go with the higher price, but it's just 1 year and no public reference. Now they're kind of sitting there being like, where are our priorities? And we could probably sign up for an extra year and be a public reference because we like the product, and I'll get a bit of a better price deal. And so by doing that, thinking about what the macro level point there is like, what are the things that are beneficial to you? Put them both in front of the customer in competing packages that the customer can choose between, but that both result in a really good outcome for you.
And Jonathan, I'm just very curious when I'm building out a team to make sure that they can tell the story right and they're in sync with all the product teams and everybody else. And I know you mentioned this slightly earlier, but what kind of profiles stand out to you the most when you're building out a team for customer success?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think part of that has to do with what is the role of customer success in your business. And I said I tend to try to position customer success as revenue ownership. There are products out there where it makes less sense to have one CSM covering all things in the post sale. A great example there would be like a very technical product that needs 3 or plus months of implementation and ongoing tweaking or consulting with the customer. Sometimes there are needs where you just have a customer success manager that's really responsible for product usage and engagement. And sometimes that's because there's gaps in the way the product experience is. Sometimes that's because the customers are just not that engaged with what the product is. Like I was working with a client last year where that was the case. And so they needed to have a CSM that was staying with customers and really trying to remind them of the value and trying to continue to engage them on an ongoing basis. When you layer in revenue responsibilities there and a steady cadence of renewals, it becomes completely overwhelming. And then they're split between these competing priorities. And so in that particular client example, I actually recommended them bringing in an account manager to own all the revenue components, still in the post-sale. You can figure out how you interact the account manager and the CSMs with all the customers to make it really seamless. But then at least you have clarity of responsibilities. Sorry?
How do they differ, like in terms of the day-to-days, in terms of an account manager and like a CSM, for instance?
Yeah, the account manager would be the person that's responsible for revenue. So they would be looking at, okay, we've got the overall book of business, who's coming up for renewal, where do we see some risks, who do I need to be engaging with, where are we in the contract process for renewals. This customer in particular this client of mine had, each CSM had 600 accounts. And so it was very high volume, very low ACV. Yeah. Wow. And so the CSMs were like constantly running engagement related work, and the AM then would just take the revenue responsibilities off their plate. And on a day-to-day basis, I mean, you could have an AM and a CSM syncing up with one customer once a quarter to build those relationship pillars. But the relationship at that ACV level and for that spend level is just not as critical as if it was, hey, Amazon's our customer. It's a multi-million-dollar contract. We need to have people that are really deeply involved in the relationship and multi-threading. And so I guess going back to your question, who do you hire? It really depends on the definition of what customer success should be for your business. That's often one of the huge questions that I'm getting by working with my clients is like, what's the state of our customer success function and how do we shape it in the right direction? What priorities should we have and who should we be hiring for it? But again, it's based on the responsibilities that you want them to have. And those responsibilities, I think, have to come from what kind of customer expectation you're trying to build. And if you're orienting around, okay, our customers buy this product, this is the expectation that they have, you start thinking about the segments that you want to put your customers into and what resourcing you have against those segments, that starts to point you in the direction, okay, I need a CSM who has, this level of depth, technical experience, this much revenue ownership in their past. Where are their spikes? Well, they're spiking on building great relationships and thinking strategically on, whatever. So
cool. And now I guess I'll take this as a segue to ask you. It's like, how do you work with your current clients or your current startups? Yeah. Like, what cadence do you usually check in with them? What questions do you usually like to ask when you first sit down with them? And what does that look like?
Yeah, well, I've just finished up my first year of working in this way, and so it's been successful, good learnings along the way. But I've been ironing that out, and what I've learned is I think about it in three major buckets, and it tries to keep everybody in the same. It tries to be clear around how I work with clients. But the first is an advisory bucket. I think about that as like 4 hours a month. Consulting, I think about 4 hours a week. And fractional leadership would be more like 4 hours a day. But typically I'm working with clients on diagnosing the state of their customer success operation, figuring out what those priorities are. Oftentimes that work is now shifting into next phases where I'm actually doing the work as a consultant to build out certain processes, to resegment customers, help them set targets, implement tooling. I'm working with a client right now based in Ireland to hire up a head of customer success, start to build out a team. And then recently I've been working with founders, not even recently, but the last 6 months, been working with founders as an executive coach, helping them think through their customer success strategy and helping them think about kind of effective management at the leadership level. So that's been kind of a fun new addition too.
And this is, I think I shared something with you on WhatsApp the other day. This is a burgeoning space, right? Especially, I think, fractional, because you have a lot of, like mid to senior level tech execs who have either seen a business they're in fold or been part of people being let go, or in that post-COVID, I want to do something different. Let's see what my life could look like. And you don't have to go into numbers, especially not numbers related to Kfund, please and thank you. But I think a lot of people are interested in how you structure that? Do you do it project based? Do you do it hourly based generally? How much wiggle room will you give founders you think are really interesting? Obviously, if you're working with a seed company that you think has huge potential, it might make more sense to take a little bit of equity as a kicker alongside a fee that might be lower. Like, how, if you're presented with new opportunities, how do you generally think about them?
It's a great question. I think it's always important to understand the company and what the founder or company might need through our work together. And so always start with an initial conversation. I've got a bunch of questions that I tend to go through, asking about scope, asking about priorities, getting a sense of that company. I typically would then go and set the scope, come back with a proposal. It's rare that I'll do just an hourly time tracking type of thing. I'll try to set it up where it's like a monthly set of expectations or a project-based expectation. And, and so then I'll share the proposal and go from there. And it really varies, and it kind of shifts as we go.
Fantastic. Yeah. Yes, actually, that's a great question to wrap up on as we're quietly sending each other messages in the background. You've been in Europe for 18 months. We could only say to an American that you've been in Europe. You've been in Portugal with time in Spain for 18 months. Yeah. Ecosystem-wise, we're obviously looking at kind of chalk and cheese in terms of the ecosystems you have in Spain and Portugal versus what you're used to in the Valley. But what is I don't know, what have you been surprised by here? What have you learned? What's your kind of overall feeling on the ecosystems that you're engaging with across Iberia at the moment? And
I guess also what each ecosystem could learn from one another, I guess.
What they could learn from each other too, yeah. I've been really enjoying getting to know the ecosystem. Started off digging in with Portugal and some of the Portuguese VCs, and then have been expanding into Spain and starting to learn more about that ecosystem as well. I think that something that's really notable for these European companies is that, especially in a place like Portugal, Portugal is a country of 10 million people. The US is 330 million people. Portugal's GDP is like 250 billion. The US is like 32 trillion. So different magnitudes of scale. But what that means is that a lot of these Portuguese companies, even at the earliest stage, have to expand internationally to open up market size. And in the US, it's a luxury that you can wait until Series B to start even thinking about having an office. I mean, Dropbox didn't have an office. The first office we did internationally was 2014 in Australia, but we had like 100 million users by that point. I mean, it was a totally different time. And so I think like there's this really interesting dynamic here of needing to essentially launch, show some traction, and then expand. And I think that's really exciting, but also I think is very challenging. I was just talking to another Kfund portfolio company yesterday, but they were talking about their success in Spain, which has been off the charts, but then getting some tougher traction as they go into Germany. Why? There's big cultural differences. And so like having to crack that nut, I think is both a bigger challenge earlier on to a company with limited resources, but at the same time builds like durability. And I love that. I think that's really interesting. I think, the other thing that I'd say is that there are a lot of early stage companies. I'm finding there's just a very broad array of early stage startups here in Portugal. I don't know what the situation is in Spain. There's a ton of energy. It feels a lot like 2012, 2013 in San Francisco. I think that the funding environment is obviously way smaller generally, especially here in Portugal. But at the same time, there's a lot of energy. But the observation that I'd have is that, the U.S. startup market is years and years ahead, and there's been a lot of things that have been learned and a lot of failures and tough lessons along the way. And so I guess one thing that I'd encourage companies in Southern Europe to really try to think about is being students of what has already been done and not try to recreate the wheel, but try to take the lessons. Even if it's not 100% answer, get to 80% by learning from what has been done in the past, whether it's pricing and packaging or whether it's rolling out or whether it's product development cycles, whatever it might be. Learn from those examples to try to shorten the curve, because I think the other thing is you've got to be able to move quickly and efficiently.
So we can have a second plug for your first round review, because I think that is, well, as you were saying that, I was thinking, where are the best kind of hacks into that kind of information and stuff like those long reads are phenomenal for it. Well, look, Jonathan, this has been an absolute pleasure. We are very, very lucky to be working with you, and this has been a really, really fascinating conversation. Even I think for the both of us, we've spent quite a lot of time with you to learn a lot more about who you are and what you've done, and how concerningly structured your way of thinking is. So I think the last question that we have to ask, that we always ask everyone, is could you recommend us, please, a book or a piece of content and someone else that we should be inviting to the podcast?
Yeah, and someone else. Okay. On the book and content side of things, I just finished reading The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel.
That was a good one.
Yeah. Fantastic. Really crisp, well written, a lot of good food for thought. On the content side, I'd say also just read How to Do What You Love, which Paul Graham. Just really good frameworks around thinking about meaningful work. And so I think that's great. Recommendation for the next podcast? I might recommend my wife.
That might be a first.
She's fantastic. They'll focus on climate companies and brand marketing for those clients, but extremely charismatic and genuine. I think she'd have some good insights for you.
Fantastic. Well, you'll have to make the intro.
I would love to be on that one, actually. Very interested in the whole brand marketing, psychology of things. It's amazing.
Well, look, it's never any specific day of the week in podcast world, but it is a Friday in the real world. So, Jonathan, thank you. As I say, a real pleasure. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you very soon.
You guys too. Appreciate the time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, mate.